Welcome to Spotlight on Schools. We focus on Rochester City Schools. I'm your host, Jim Strauss. On May 5th, the Democrat and Chronicle published a column by Erica Bryant titled, "No School Should Be an Island of Poverty." It began this way. Imagine a public school where the children of doctors attend class with the children of fast food clerks. Imagine a school that draws students from Fairport and Greece, from Park Avenue and Hudson Avenue. Imagine a school where the test score gap between rich and poor is a crevice rather than a chasm. There are schools like this all over the country. There's no reason that we can't have some in Rochester. Erica went on to talk about how she'd been attending a work group focusing on creating magnet schools for Monroe County as part of a larger organization called Great Schools for All. Erica spoke about an event Great Schools for All was holding the following Tuesday in which all the work groups would share their research and proposed action steps. I attended that event. It's a privilege in the next two programs to share some of what I learned with you. Joining me today are the Great School for All co-conveners, Lynette Sparks and John Wilkinson. As interim associate pastor of outreach and evangelism at Third Presbyterian Church in Rochester, Lynette Sparks oversees the congregation's extensive outreach programs in the areas of education, hunger, homelessness, and advocacy. She is actively involved with strategic planning for Urban Presbyterians Together and with denominational efforts in organizational transformation. Prior to her service in the church, Lynette worked in the corporate world in Minneapolis and Detroit. John Wilkinson has been pastor of the Third Presbyterian Church in Rochester since 2001. He's been active denominationally through service on the Theological Task Force on Peace, Unity, and Purity for the church. He served on the board of Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School for 9 years. He is past moderator of the Presbytery of Genesee Valley and is an active participant in Urban Presbyterians Together in Rochester. He previously served in 2 Chicago churches. John is also on the education work group of the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative. Welcome to Spotlight on Schools.
Thank you.
We had some problems finding a day that we could work together for this conversation, but I'm glad we finally did it. Much of what we're going to talk about today and the next week appears in your website, gs4a.org. Viewers can also find it by Googling Great Schools for All. On the home page, under the About tab, are 4 other tabs: Mission, Leadership, How We Were Formed, and Defining the Problem. I'd like to start with the last one, Defining the Problem. As you began to study the problems in the city of Rochester, what facts stood out to you?
The concentration of poverty in Rochester is quite extraordinary. We've learned that from the Community Foundation research. And we have looked at research on education policy and learned that when the concentration of poverty in any given school is more than about 40 to 50%, that significantly impacts the child's ability to learn. And so our focus is on economic integration, socioeconomic integration, and reducing the concentration of poverty. Mm-hmm. We've learned that it makes more difference to a student in terms of their performance in the concentration of poverty in their school, even than it does their own individual family situation.
Mm-hmm. Some of the statistics that you cited on your website, for example, the concentration of poverty among cities of the size of Rochester, we rank 5th worst in the country. Mm-hmm. The concentration of poverty in our cities, some of the elementary schools are at 50 or 60, but most hover around 90%.
Yes.
Concentration of poverty. Okay. Anything like that?
No, just simply that we know there are lots of really good, committed people, parents, families, community organizations, principals, administrators, and teachers especially are working really hard in the Rochester City Schools to deliver a quality education. But this poverty concentration makes the playing field so uneven that it's hard to achieve success. Mm-hmm. So we're committed to supporting all those groups, but with Great Schools for All, really committed to looking at that concentration of poverty as a really key factor in changing the landscape.
Mm-hmm. I want to draw to the audience's attention, I'll put this up on the screen now. There is a chart from the Rochester Area Community Foundation that appears in your flyer. This chart graphed the failure rate on the grade 3 English language test for Monroe County school districts, including Rochester, plotted against the percentage of students who live in poverty. The failure rate is in red, the poverty rate is in blue. Notice how carefully they correspond. Look at the Rochester rate, with a poverty rate for third graders near 90% and a failure rate near 80%. Right next to it, alphabetically, Pittsford has a poverty rate around 3% and a failure rate just over 10%. The correlation goes across the board. The message is clear. Being poor affects your academic performance. And I haven't seen a chart or a graph that so clearly demonstrates that fact as the one I saw in your flyer. It's stunning.
It is.
Governor Cuomo must have seen that, and he knows that. And yet, teachers are going to be evaluated by the performance of their students, no matter where they teach.
And as we see that chart, that is why we are so committed to building a community coalition, that the entire Rochester region really needs to come together to help our children succeed.
Okay, so let's talk about Great Schools for All. How was it formed?
Well, Great Schools for All is an outgrowth of lots of conversations over many years. It began, the seeds more recently were planted at a gathering of tutors, in fact. And William Calla, who many of us know both as his leadership in Fairport and also as the interim superintendent in the Rochester schools, talked about a book that we should read, a book by Gerald Grant, who taught at Syracuse University, called Hope and Despair in the American City, Why There Are No Bad Schools in Raleigh. So a group of us read that book. We're intrigued by it. I think we might talk about it a little bit more in this conversation.
Yes.
And then we went to talk to Gerald Grant in Syracuse, and we're intrigued by his ideas, what he learned looking at the Raleigh schools. Got a little bit of a grant from the Rochester Area Community Foundation, sent a handful of us down to Raleigh to learn what was going on, and the rest kind of took over from there. We were compelled by what we saw and said, is there anything from Raleigh that might be transported back to Rochester and help us change the landscape, the profile of what's going on here? That happened within the last couple of years. Great Schools has kind of been more of a formal organization, although we're still loosely organized and kind of very organic and fluid, about a year ago or so.
It began within the Presbyterian Church, but it's by no means a Presbyterian organization.
It has long moved beyond that.
Okay.
We will continue to stay involved, as Presbyterians have been in education, public education, throughout our history. But yes, absolutely, we're a community organization.
Okay, you were going to say something.
I think I lost that for the moment.
Okay, who we are. Before we go into detail about the things you learned from your study of Raleigh, I want to look at what you wrote on the website under leadership, some of which appears in the heading of Who We Are in your pamphlet, and I'm going to quote this. Great Schools for All Leadership Group is an amalgam of Monroe County, city and suburban residents with diverse professional and experiential backgrounds seeking to build a coalition around socioeconomic integration of schools in the greater Rochester area. Great Schools for All is both, quote, grassroots and grass tops. What does that mean? Grassroots, I understand. What does grass tops mean?
I like that paragraph, though. We should just leave
I
it
will
at that.
finish it.
Okay, there you go. I think it means that there are, so to take a step back, we began, as you suggested, as a Presbyterian effort. We're no longer, not only not Presbyterian, although those roots are still there, but we're not faith-based, although the faith-based community has been active in our conversation. So we began to build relationships. All of this, I think, is about relationship building, and connected with some people in leadership positions, but also some concerned neighbors and citizens. So that's the grassroots and the grass tops, people in different areas of life, and people began to get interested in this. So we've kind of built what I call a movement more than an organization, filled with lots of different kinds of people.
Okay. Well, let me continue
All right.
in that paragraph. Individual volunteers and institutional representatives, parents, grandparents, business people, clergy, educators, researchers, journalists, lawyers, students, tutors, and community activists, all dedicated to reversing the failure of high poverty schools through a variety of voluntary integration strategies. Members of the leadership group are not representatives of elected officials, school board members or administrators, school district employees, or advocates for a specific solution. Now, I have a few questions about this. First of all, how did you attract all these people? How did you find them, or how did they find you?
Well, I think it's as we have been involved at Third Church in the community for 180 years, and more recently, you connect with people. You go to meetings, you go to conferences, you go to workshops, and you connect with people. They learn what you're doing, you learn what they're doing, and you build connections and you have conversations. So we began to make this case. In fact, the Raleigh group was the beginning efforts of that, a very broad-based group that went even amongst those 11 people.
We, relationships, and particularly we did not have elected officials on the leadership team because we're really focused on the principle. We're concerned mostly about the outcome, that all children will be able to learn and be able to succeed in school. And we have, as much as possible, are trying to take the mind of a researcher to look at the evidence and what does the evidence say matters when it comes to educational outcomes for children. So as we planned our trip to Raleigh, we wanted to go and be as objective as humanly possible without a particular agenda for a particular outcome, but simply to go and to ask questions, to ask hard questions about what works in this system, what didn't work, what might be possible for Rochester. And so we notified a lot of people before we went. We spoke to people in the school district, we spoke to people in community leadership. We had a lot of one-on-one meetings ahead of time, telling them we were going to learn and see what we could find out, and that we were going to come back and speak with them and share with them what we learned afterwards.
You mentioned no elected officials or official representatives of educational institutions. At some point down the road, you will bring what you have to these people, I'm guessing.
Well, yes. Well, we have already. So when we came back from Raleigh a year ago in April, we began a very kind of comprehensive communication campaign. So we've sat with elected officials. We put together a brilliant PowerPoint and shared it with lots of different people in small groups and large groups. So to say we don't have that group represented is true, but to say we haven't been in ongoing communication, conversation with lots of different people, both agency heads, appointed officials like superintendents and school board members, but also elected officials in the county and in the city and in the central school district. So people are very aware of what we've been up to. We're not at the point yet because we're still developing our proposals to ask people to sign on. But again, it's what has struck us, I think, is how interested people are not only in what went on in Raleigh, which is a great story, but then what we can make portable back to Rochester. I think people are looking for bright spots, best practices, and here's a good story. We've, since Raleigh, have learned of other places in the country that are doing interesting things. But without exception, people have been very open to hearing what we've been up to. That doesn't mean they're buying into a proposal, or doesn't mean there haven't been questions and some pushback. That's natural and what we hope will happen. But again, an openness to change what things look like in our city and in our community.
Okay, well, we are done with the first segment. It went very quickly. So we're going to take a break. We're going to come back, and when we do, we're going to talk more about what happened in Raleigh. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. We're talking with Lynette Sparks and John Wilkinson, co-conveners of Great Schools for All. We've been talking about leading up to a trip to Raleigh, North Carolina that a group of people from Great Schools for All made to look at a model that some people have been talking about replicating, perhaps at least in part, in the Rochester area. Lynette, you were one of those people who went.
I was.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there were 11 of us that went to Raleigh to learn what we could about finding options for Rochester that might make a difference.
30 years ago, tell us what that situation was in Raleigh and Wake County.
The situation in Raleigh and Wake County was really very much like what we have in Rochester today. High concentrations of poverty, failing schools, and a situation of really quite significant segregation.
In the city.
In the city. And what essentially happened in Raleigh was they eventually combined their one city district and one suburban district into one county-wide district, created a lot of magnet schools and other options, a lot of which were put in the city to help start to mix up the concentration of poverty so that you didn't have just one, have really high need schools compared to schools that had, a very low percentage of poverty in the schools. So they used a variety of strategies. And obviously the question is, and it's been talked about in Rochester for years, well, we can't do a countywide school system. Raleigh had two districts to merge. We have 19 different districts. So we went to ask questions, to really dig into the nuances of what Raleigh did, and to learn were there strategies beneath that countywide system that we could apply here, perhaps on a voluntary basis, in creative ways, recognizing the difficulties of having 19 different districts. And we learned a lot.
One thing I'd like to add here, the big fear in the county down there was that by bringing people from the city out to the county, the performance, the scores would be drawn down of those people who lived in the county. While it would help, it had to help the people in the city. They were afraid it would hurt the performances of the kids. What did they find out?
It did not hurt the performance. And in fact, research around the country also bears that fact, that by socioeconomically integrating the schools, the children who live in poverty, their achievement rose significantly. And those students from middle class and affluent families, their scores did not drop.
And that figure you mentioned in the first segment of about 40%, if one could maintain that, one found that the benefits were enormous, not only for the people who were poor, but for the people who were not used to mixing with a crowd they hadn't mixed with before.
Well, one of the premises in Raleigh is that children are not at risk. All children are at promise. And the idea that all children have something to teach one another, all children have something to learn from one another. And we saw this play out in unique ways. As we visited schools, we interviewed over 75 community leaders, people from the civil rights activists back in the early days in the 1970s and early 80s, up to leaders today. We spoke to school board members and educators and parents. We spoke to business people who are involved in schools. We learned about how the community and how the business community supported all of the school education efforts. And the faith communities were a big part of the community outreach. It was really quite an extraordinary community coming together that resulted in a significantly different outcome than what we have in our Rochester City schools.
You described the difference between their county system with essentially one county district as opposed to our 18 suburban districts. It may be difficult. It may be a very difficult political sell for anything like that to happen here. But what can we learn from that might be applicable in our area?
Well, I think there's a lot to learn. One is some of the things are kind of quality lessons, to have a community banded together to make change for children. And I do think right now in Rochester and Monroe County, there is a hunger and an appetite to do things differently. I think if you go across the board, the anti-poverty initiative, different school initiatives, different conversations that are community-wide saying, we know we've tried things before, this feels different qualitatively. I think also we've learned from the Raleigh-Wake County experience that while we're not seeking to replicate the model, things like magnet schools that would bring students across districts, both into suburban districts but also into the city, so to have compelling, promising magnet school opportunities could be done without making it a unified system. Also things that are already in place, like an urban-suburban program that just celebrated its 50th anniversary. Districts are adding to the list in our community. We think that's promising to get a mix going back and forth both ways, urban-suburban, suburban-urban. Also to think about particular schools that might exist in the county that could be magnets drawing from different regions. And also to build, we also have another focus on summer learning. Summer learning can certainly happen across district without any legislative change. So we do think there are a whole menu of possibilities that could happen without unifying the county in its schools. And we're intrigued by what that can do because of what we learned in Raleigh, also because of what we've learned in other places like the Twin Cities, like Omaha, other places that are trying to do things differently. And it's a cliche by now, but to move the needle on achievement and on integration.
Mm-hmm. For those of you who are interested in learning more about this for yourself, it's an excellent resource for learning about the history of Wake County school success. And it's on the Great Schools for All website, gs4a.org website homepage. It's under resources. Select media, and it's the first option. Community United, it's called. This is a video of a panel of stakeholders who talked about how that change came about. It's quite informative. I was very impressed by it. Well, let's move on to the November of 2014 conference. One of the things that occurred there was you had a number of these people from Wake County come up. Would you talk about what was the plan leading up to the 2014 conference?
So coming back from April, we spent the whole rest of the spring and summer talking to a bunch of different groups. They were intrigued by what we learned and compelled by the story, so we said we need to get a larger group together. So we had kind of 3 points to do in our November conference. One was to bring some people from Raleigh up to tell the story, because nothing is more interesting than to hear the story from the people who've made it happen, and that was really good. So we brought 5 people up, and they presented, and people were really, I think, taken by that story and by the breadth of the experience. We had school board members and business people and parents and teachers and everything came up in that 5. Then we wanted to hear from somebody who knew what they were talking about. So Kara Finnegan, who teaches at the Warner School at the University of Rochester, presented a kind of white paper on our issue and what models, not only from the Raleigh experience but across the country, and doing some analysis and some perspective sharing, and it really was quite impressive. And then what we really wanted to do is take that input, both from the Raleigh people and from Professor Finnegan, and say, so what now? So we had 150 people, broken down into some conversations, and really this has been a process-driven, grassroots-led, participatory effort to make sure it's not just a handful of people trying to say, here's what's going to happen next. So we went through the whole exercise of seeing what would bubble up and what were the most important things, and that led us to the work groups that were formed after the November event.
Okay. Kara Finnegan's white paper, she presented, as I see it from your literature, 4 policy options.
Yes.
First, improve current schools. 2, adopt place-based approaches such as wraparound services. 3, strengthen cross-district collaboration to enable student movement across boundaries. And the 4th, create countywide regional strategies to address issues like educational equity. Those were the 4 options
Yes.
you presented. As I understand it, most of the movement was toward the 3rd and the 4th options. Student movement across
Yes.
boundaries and countywide.
Yes, it was. We know that there are lots of really good and really important efforts happening in the first 2 options on Professor Finnegan's continuum. We looked at the work that was being done, and the piece to us that seemed was not being addressed was that systemic issue, the issue of the playing field, the issue that it's not an even playing field. And so our unique contribution, we believe, to this entire, a whole section, a whole conglomeration of solutions that are going to be required, our unique contribution is the systemic piece that without addressing the issues around the concentration of poverty in schools, the other policy options will only be able to partially achieve what they hope to do without the systemic changes.
Okay. One of the things, as a result of the things that bubbled up out of this meeting, You then devised 6 working groups. Would you
Yes.
tell us what they are?
We had a working group looking at urban-suburban, which is an existing program, and how could it be expanded to create more cross-district opportunities, not just from urban to suburban, but also from suburban to urban. We created a work group around looking at options and possibilities for countywide magnet schools. A work group that focused on regional planning and what type of regional planning efforts might help bring some improvement. We looked at summer learning and what kind of summer learning opportunities could be created, because summer learning does not have the legislative barriers that any other programs throughout the school year would require. And it seemed to us to be not only a way to test out and pilot some programs, but also to get some results sooner. We also created a legislative work group, which was had kind of morphed into work that Great Schools has been doing as we've been continuing our community conversations. And we're working on creating some legislative options that would open up possibilities for Monroe County that currently are prohibited by state law. And then finally, we created a work group that for the time being we called Outreach and Diversity, which is a very, very broad scope, recognizing that there are not only many people that we want to hear this information and to be part of the discussion, but also to bring more of them into our work that we're doing and banding that together. And again, that's really based on all the research and our Raleigh visit, that it really took an entire community and many, many pieces come together to create the kind of change that we're looking for.
And as I understand it, your goal was to then present what each of these groups worked on, and they worked on a regular basis to present their findings at a May conference, and that's the one that I went to.
Right.
We're getting a little short on time here, so what I'd like you to do is to tell us if those people who are interested in your work or to find out more about it, what can they do?
So it's easy to do that, and we'd welcome anybody who wants to participate to jump on this train. Go to our website, it's the easiest thing, gs4a.org, and there you'll find ways to contact Lynette and myself, and we'll just take it from there.
Okay. On that website, I've been there. There's a lot of stuff on there. You can access articles, reports, and videos documenting the importance of socioeconomic integration as essential to improving educational outcomes from the poorest children in our country. Took that right from the pamphlet. It might sound like that, but there's a lot of information there. I've read a number of those articles. Very compelling stuff. You can read more about upcoming Great Schools for All events on there as well. Would you care to plug the others? You have a Twitter account. At GS4AROC. Facebook, GS4AROC. Email, you want to give that out?
contact@gs4a.org.
Okay, all those ways. All right, I want to thank Lynette Starks and John Wilkinson, co-conveners of Great Schools for All, for joining us this week. Next week, we're going to focus on May 2014. Great things that happened there. So come back next Monday and Wednesday, 7:30 for part 2. Thank you for joining us at Spotlight on Schools. See you next week. Good night.